Hello, good morning. My name's Ian Woodhouse, and I would love to have been there with you in person this morning, but due to matters all my responsibility, I'm somewhere else. So I've decided to make a little video. Now, there's two things about doing a little video lecture. One is that it's going to be posted on YouTube, so I won't mind, and please forgive me for rushing through things really quickly. It's a real fast overview to cover lots of material, but try to do it in half an hour. But you'll be able to go and look on YouTube and you'll be able to watch the video at your own pace. And if there are things that you thought were interesting or worthwhile taking a few more minutes to think about and look through, you can go and take a look at that at your leisure. Now you'll notice the title is about a primer for poster presentations. I'm using posters as a mechanism to talk about visual communication. So these principles that I will talk about also apply to website design, they apply to doing little flyers, arguably they apply to anything that's in picture-based format where you're trying to visually communicate things rather than just with text. I'm not going to cover data visualization. That's something that you will learn about elsewhere. So I'm assuming that you know how to take data and to present it in a meaningful way. This is more about how you put together a combination of text and graphics, how you do the layout, how you present it in a way which effectively communicates. So there's no right or wrong answers in many of these things. There's just effective or not effective. Now that idea of picturing it, so this little quote from Albert Einstein, if I can't picture it, I can't understand it, kind of sums up what I'm trying to get at here, is that there is value in learning how to create pictures as a way of communication. What you're trying to do is help your audience understand something through picturing it. So in this particular lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about, give you some advice on creating posters, and I'll leave it up to you to be able to take that advice and generalize it. So I'm going to look at how you approach it, just a very quick snippet on software format and structure. So how do you actually format things together? How do you look at the layout? A little bit on text and a small amount on images. You guys, being students of GIS, will know quite a lot about images already, so I won't have to talk a lot about that. And then I'll quickly skim through some examples. So, approach. These are my golden rules. Studies, in inverted commas, would suggest that you've got in the region of 10-11 seconds to convince your audience that they are worthwhile investing some more of their time. So what you have to do is hook them in. So one of the key things is how do you get somebody to look at your material? If it's a flyer on a coffee table, if it's a poster at a scientific conference, if it's a web page when somebody's browsing very quickly, how do you get them to stop and actually look in a little bit more detail? You've got to do that pretty fast. Help your audience to navigate the material on the poster. Basically, assume your audience is lazy. And you have to then make it as easy as possible for them to consume your material. If you make it difficult, then very quickly, within that 11 seconds, they'll have decided that actually that looks quite difficult. They're going to go on to something a bit easier. If you can make it easy for them to navigate and find their way through their material, you can actually put a lot of material on a poster or any kind of visual medium if you can make it easy for your audience to navigate. And the third one is to reward your audience. If somebody is going to invest time looking at or reading your material, make sure you've actually got something that makes it worth their while, so they actually go away thinking, yes, that was a good, sensible use of my time. That's a little note in terms of in the days when we made assessments of posters. Okay, a few do's and don'ts. Don't design your poster by illustrating your text. The big mistake people do is write the text first and then they try to throw in some graphics. You'll end up with too many words if you do that. Do design your poster by creating fantastic imagery first. Okay, so make your pictures, do your graphics, do a mind map, do some spider diagrams, do whatever it is that helps you to organize your material in a non-linear way on a flat piece of paper, and then annotate it to make it clearer. So add your words afterwards Do your pictures first and then add the words. That way it will help to minimize the addition of lots of words. Here's a nice set of things. I effectively cut and paste these out of a nice graphic design book, so they look a little bit hand-waving-y, graphics designy kind of way. But let's talk through them. So what you want to do with your visual communication is you want to construct the argument objectively with the means of visual communication. Okay, you are trying to present an argument. You're trying to present, especially in a scientific context, you're trying to present something meaningful, and there is an argument, there's a story there that you're trying to present. B is to construct the text and illustrative material systematically and logically. So that is about the navigation. If it's systematic and logical, your audience will find it easy to find their way around. Perhaps a more aesthetic thing is C, to organize the text and illustrations in a compact arrangement with its own rhythm. That's the kind of thing we really need to see some examples of, and I'll show you some examples later. When you see something that's got rhythm, you will immediately understand what the idea of rhythm is. Again, it would D, to put together the visual material so that it is readily intelligible and structured with a high degree of tension. Again, sounds a little bit hand-waving-y, but that idea of tension is that sense that it actually belongs together, it fits together. It looks like it is a nice pile of Jenga blocks that actually looks like they're fit together and that they're balanced. So software. Generally, if you're trying to do something with visual communication, I wouldn't suggest using a word processing package. Things like PowerPoint are a bit better because they're specifically designed to be kind of non-linear, two-dimensional way of constructing a page. If you really want to get serious about your graphic communication, you want to get into something sensible, the Corel Draws or the Adobe Illustrators are the way to go in order to do it really well. Format and structure. It's worthwhile to know just a little bit about page layouts. So the A paper system actually goes back to, I think it was a French physicist in the 19th century, nicely ordered so that the A0 or A0 is exactly 1 square meter, and the proportions of the A paper sizes are such that if you cut it in half, the ratio of the length to breadth of the two smaller pieces of paper is exactly the same as the ratio of the length to breadth of the original large size piece of paper. That means as you keep cutting them smaller and smaller, they're all exactly the same proportions. You might have thought that was invented for the benefit of photocopiers, because it does make enlarging or shrinking things very easy, but in actual fact it predates photocopiers by quite a substantial number of years. It's useful for you to know that, because if you're designing something on an A0 piece of paper, for example, you can actually sketch it out on an A4, and it's proportionally it will be correct. And of course it goes down to smaller sizes. So A5 and A6 are the smaller versions of A4. How is your poster read? What I mean by this is, how do people naturally navigate? In Western Roman-based languages, people will tend to read top left to bottom right. In places like China, they might have more of a tendency to read top to bottom, but they also, in the context of pinyin, would read left to right as well. So top left to bottom right is a fairly good way to start off. So without having to think about anything, that would be what your default is. In actual fact, when it comes to a two-dimensional, non-linear layout of material on a piece of paper, an audience will actually go to somewhere around about a third from the top, round about in the middle. That'll be the first place they look at, and then they actually go upwards, and then they scan down top left to bottom right. You can exploit that by putting something, so in that middle graphic there, if you put something really interesting where the eye is, your audience is naturally going to go there first anyway. So give them something worthwhile to look at, and that's where you're going to catch their attention and make them want to read on. A few examples. This is an example of a poster I did some time ago. It was a very linear story. It had a sort of A means B means C means D kind of story to it. So I purposefully did a top left to bottom right, and I enforced people to read it like that by making it a cartoon sort of motif, so that people naturally would want to read that in rows from top left to bottom right. Not necessarily an example of a good poster, by the way, because everybody remembers, everybody who was at that conference where I presented that poster would come to me many months later, or years even later, and say how much they liked my cartoon-like poster. But then they'd say, oh, couldn't remember what it was about. So in terms of visual communication, it's arguably making sure they actually remember what the topic is an important thing. Just making it look interesting is not enough in itself. Here's another one. This is an example where what I was trying to do is get people to look at the main image in the middle first. And then you start in the middle, you look at the images, you go up to the top, which is the context. So it's in Scotland, it's in Glenafric, a bit more information. And as you work your way down to the bottom right, you get to progressively more and more detailed information about the work that was done. This is maybe the first example of what might be called rhythm, and it's maybe not the best example, but what I mean by that is all the different boxes, even the one that's tilted, all those different small boxes are roughly the same size and proportion, and the blocks of text are roughly the same size and proportion. So that what it's trying to do is to look like it kind of hangs together. This is an interesting architect called Ching, wrote a lovely book, all hand-drawn, 1979, wonderful book. So I nicked that out of here, this collection of ordering principles. So the idea that an axis is a line, it's a very linear story. So if you're telling a linear story, you might think of an axis. And it needn't be a straight line, it could be a wiggly line, but it's a linear story. If you're trying to tell a story which is comparative, it's before and after. It's two different geographical locations, or it's two different halves of an experiment. Some kind of symmetrical form is a very good way of telling that story, because you've got two parallel axes, basically. The idea of I'll jump to the datum there on the middle on the right hand side. A datum is a more non-linear story. It's a bit like taking a map and just annotating it. So maps, in fact, generally are fantastic examples of that kind of non-linear pattern, which is the way of telling a story, but not in any particular order. The top right there is the idea of rhythm and repetition. So even though it's different shapes and colors, they look like they are proportionally together. They're all part of the same team. And that idea of rhythm is well, that's a small example there. It's also things to do with the spacing between those boxes. It makes it look like they are sensibly ordered. The ones down at the bottom are a little bit order, so I'm going to talk about hierarchy in a little while. But the idea that you make some things look more important than others. So even in a very ordered sense, you can draw attention to one or two things in preference to everything else, so that the human eye is drawn to that little square that's on its edge there. And you would, if that was pictures or text, you would be drawn to have a look at that before looking at all the other ones. The idea of transformation and ordering principles is that idea that you take the same pattern and you change it or you use it in many different ways. So this, for example, this poster arguably, in terms of the spacing and the layout of the smaller boxes in the text, is trying to generate a bit of rhythm. I could have probably done it if I was to do this again. This is about 10 years old, this poster. If I was to do it again, I would probably try to instill a little bit more rhythm into that. And it's what I would call a datum format, in that it is a central piece, and the boxes around it you can actually read in any order. There's no reason to, there's no numbers, there's no labels, there's no, it doesn't matter if you actually read that information from bottom right to top left. Okay, composition. So how do you put things together in an effective way? We've looked at some of the ordering principles, but what about composition? Now, some of you might have come across the rule of thirds. If you've ever written or read an introduction to photography, for example, they'll always talk about the rule of thirds. So when you're taking a nice landscape photograph, you tend to put the horizon about a third from the top or a third from the bottom. For some reason, human beings tend to kind of like things around about a third of, or proportions of thirds. And if you look at lots of famous pieces of artwork that are considered to be very aesthetically pleasing compositions, you find that those intersections of the thirds are where key things are happening. So the big wave in Hokusai's tsunami wave here, the idea of Fujiyama in the background, and the small wave that echoes the shape of Fujiyama in the foreground, and they all lie in the intersections of these thirds. And being Japanese, they also emphasize the importance of the absence of something. So the fact that there's nothing in the other intersection is significant and actually adds to the composition. And you can see thirds everywhere you go. So the horizon and the scream's face there are about proportions of a third. Even the abstract things of somebody like Paul Klee, you see the horizon type thing and the eye type thing are around about a third from the top and the bottom. And even on many popular bits of artwork and album covers and everything else, you will see this proportion of thirds. So the two key things you're drawn to in this picture is Tom Waits' face and Tom Waits' fingers on the piano, which are roughly a third from the top and a third from the bottom. Why do we like thirds so much? Not very sure. The most convincing argument I've heard is that the human face, not the baldy one on the right, but the human face generally with hair, is proportioned such that the most important features that you want to get information from, the eyes and the mouth, are proportioned roughly a third from the top and a third from the bottom. So from the very day that you were born, you're programmed to look at a blank canvas like a face and be drawn to the eyes and the mouth as where your visual cues, that's where you're going to get most of the information from. So you're tempted to look there first. It's an explanation. I don't necessarily claim that it's true, but it's certainly it's the most satisfying explanation I've come across. As with everything, these rules can be broken. They're not absolutely set in stone. So this particular example, there is no formula. So the rule of thirds is a guideline. It's a way of you can default to thirds and you'll get away with it more often than not. The key thing is there's no right or wrong way to do any of these things. There's effective and there's non-effective ways. So some other do's and don'ts. So don't use landscape orientation. I mean, I say that in this context, but you'll find that if you go down to the Grant Institute, all the geophysicists and the geologists are being told that they must do it in landscape orientation. So partly depends on the context and the culture that you're in. Don't default into a linear layout. You write your dissertations and things, and you write most documents in a linear way, a beginning, a middle, and an end. You don't have to do that. You can actually, and I would encourage you to think more non-linearly. How do you break that down into pieces which don't necessarily have to be read in order? Using guidelines to keep things neat is a good idea. Even things like PowerPoint allow you to have guidelines, and you can snap to those guidelines so everything's in line and nicely ordered. And do make sure you consider how the eye moves across your poster or your whatever visual medium that you're using. A little bit in text. So typefaces are interesting. You mostly read typefaces by looking at the top. Okay, so you should be able to read that or take a guess that that's the legibility of typefaces. When you only see the bottom half of the text, it's actually very difficult. So the legibility of typefaces is the thing to emphasize, not how aesthetic it is. Although some of you may consider that to be important, I would argue that the legibility is the most important thing. Generally, you can group typefaces or fonts into two groups. One is the serifed fonts, and the other is the sans serif, which means without a serif. What is a serif? That's off a little bit. But that red circle is just supposed to be on the little lip. So that extra little bit at the end of lines is the serif. So all the sans serif fonts don't have that extra little lip. Sans serif fonts tend to look very modern. Serif fonts tend to be more distinguished and old-fashioned. The reason for the serif is that it used to allow you to line up the text better. It also helps legibility because those horizontal serifs actually emphasize the horizontal nature of a line of text, and it allows your eye to follow that much better. So you have to be careful when you use a sans serif font. You should be careful of the fact that different fonts have different sizes. So these are all the same bits of text in different typefaces, going up from 6 to 90 points, and you'll notice that they have different widths, and they also have different emphasis in terms of how big they look. So even though the font has a very specific term like points, that's not uniform across all the different fonts. Block text. So you have heading text and you have block text, or you might call it paragraph text. You have to think very carefully about block text and its readability. Justifying is the name for where do you make the text straight. So the block on the left is left justified only, and the one on the right is called fully justified. Generally, for readability, left justified only is the easiest to read, right justified only is the next easiest, and fully justified is the least easiest. And the reason for that is the ragged edge actually helps your eye to keep track of which line it's reading. Now, it says there it's particularly important for sans serif fonts. The thing about serifed fonts, because it doesn't have that extra horizontal emphasis, is that it's much easier to lose your path going through a bit of text, especially if it's too wide or there's too much text before the next paragraph. So think very carefully about why you're justifying the text. Think about even things like line spacings. So when you look at line spacings, this serifed font conveniently has got those extra horizontal sense to it. If you're doing sans serifed fonts, line spacing is actually more important. You'll notice the text at the top there starts to get a little bit fuzzy to read, and it's because you don't have enough horizontal cues to keep your eyes in line. You can emphasize the horizontal nature of the text by widening the line spacing. So generally, I would say that when it's a visual communication context and you're looking at block text and you want to use a sans serif font, you should be increasing the line spacing a little bit. Just a normal line spacing isn't going to be enough. It's okay for headings or for 1 or 2 lines, but not for block text. Colors of block text. Basically, all the studies would suggest that black with a white background is the most readable, it's easiest, it's less tiring on the eye. If you're just doing headings or small bits of text, you can get away with just about anything. But the more block text there is to read, the more you want to veer towards something which is easy to read and less tiring on the eye. Certainly colours like red as a background colour, very difficult. And if you're like me and your eyes aren't perfect, you will find that if you mix colours like reds and greens, is that things start to look a little bit three-dimensional because your eyes are actually matching up the colours slightly different. Fine again for headings, but not so fine for block text. Now, length of measure. Length of measure is the technical term for basically the width of your paragraph text. It's number of characters, including spaces, and basically you should be somewhere between 30 and 70. When you get to wider than about 80 characters, it becomes really difficult. You end up at the end of the paragraph, and by the time your eye gets back to the beginning of the next line, your brain can't quite work out where the next line is, and you can get lost in that text. Especially when you're doing posters, you will be tempted to make blocks of text that go right across the poster, and you'll see examples of this everywhere, and I've done it myself, so it's an easy mistake to make. But try to watch out for that and don't do it. It's really difficult to read. Likewise, if you make it too narrow, you actually end up spending more time switching from the end of one line to the beginning of next. You end up spending more time doing that than you do actually reading the text. Hierarchy. Hierarchy is really important, especially if you want to do something non-linear. Now, you'll all know this from the context of maps. Okay, maps have fantastic examples of text hierarchy. And you use that. How do you use that hierarchy? How do you make some things more important than others? So some things are at different levels. On a map, some are to do with the titles of cities, and it's proportionate to roughly their population. Sometimes you're using the hierarchy to represent different labels. So it's names of regions rather than names of cities, for example. How do you emphasize that hierarchy? You can just place them first, second, and third. But if it's a non-linear layout, that's not going to work. You can use the weight of the text, so bold, regular, and light. That's not as light as it should be. You can use the tone, you can use the color, you can use the size. Things like weight and size are things that are often used in a map to emphasize which things are more important than others. Why is hierarchy important? Hierarchy allows people to scan the material and get a first impression very quickly. So if you see a newspaper article or a magazine article like this, you tend to read the title and then you'll go and look at these big bits of text, and that gives you a sense of whether or not you want to read on. So what it's doing is giving you some information about the whole thing. If you want to read more, you go down into the smaller bits of text. Newspapers are the obvious place where this is done, but if you go to all the best websites, if you want to go to the BBC or the CNN, you'll see they do exactly the same thing. So what do you do when you read a front page of a newspaper? You look at the headlines, you scan down and you look at all the headlines, and if there's something you're a bit more interested in, you might read some of the bold text to see what that's about. And then you decide which bits you want to read in a bit more detail. So it might be the bit at the bottom first, one of these small ones at the bottom, and then you're going to go back to one of these main topics. But basically it's fed you at the first layer of that hierarchy. You've been fed enough information for you to make a decision on which bits to read next, and you should be able to use that effectively. Another thing about newspapers that are very good, human faces always draw the attention of other humans, and you notice that human face sorry, the emphasis of this page, after you've read the title, you've got your headline there, and you've got your face there. It's round about a third from the top. It's not perfectly a third, but it's roughly in that area that you're drawn to first. So you actually read the top bit after you've looked at the picture of Tony Blair and read the title. That's a classic sort of scenario of non-linear reading of a page. Here's another little example of hierarchy, which I noticed that there's some adverts around the university just now that have nicked this idea from the Blue Motion adverts from Volkswagen, which was you basically have all the same text, but by highlighting some, or in this case by crossing out others, you effectively give the audience some text to read in priority over the others. So you read the Blue Motion saves you money first, and then you might go and read the next, the text underlying beneath the red markout. Gives you more information. That's the idea of hierarchy. Labeling and association. So you can do that by proximity. So you can have you just put numbers next to things. You can have keys that use things like colors. You can use pointers. There's lots of different ways. Generally, my advice would be that if you're having to use some kind of numbering system or pointers, or if you've got big arrows in your poster, you probably haven't thought carefully about the layout. You're probably not using that as effectively as you should. Here's a great little poster from NASA. I like this. The reason I like it is it captures many of the things that I've just been talking about. It's got a hierarchy to it, and then it's got this visual hierarchy where you can just look at these pictures and it gives you a very simple description of each stage. So cargo launch, booster separation, second stage, cargo in orbit. These numbers refer to these lists at the bottom, is that you can actually read the very linear story here and match it to the numbers. And it's got a visual graphic that links exactly the same numbers that are exactly the same size and color. So it's very easy to make that association. That's getting back to this level here where you've got both color and shape as an association. So you can immediately see that these numbers in the top figure actually represent the numbers, or these little pictures in the boxes. Nice sense of rhythm, the same size and shape of the numbers, and each of these image boxes are exactly the same size and shape. So it communicates in many different ways. You can very quickly scan what's going on, or you can read a little bit more detail if you want. Quick word on titles. People write some really dull titles for posters and things. You can read these in your own time, but I would love it if people got more into the habit of telling me exactly what your poster is about, so that I didn't have to work really hard to find out. Some open discussion about whether or not questions are good. I'm not a big fan of questions. I like to see answers, largely because I'm inspired, I guess, by newspapers. So don't dumb it down. So you got to be careful there. But if you look at newspaper headlines, U.S. attacked hijacked jets, destroy twin towers, and hit Pentagon in day of terror. It pretty much gets straight to the point. You know what the rest of it's about. The rest of it's just details. So it doesn't mince its words. It doesn't go, guess what happened today? Or how many planes hit the Pentagon today? It's not a set of questions that are trying to drag you in. It's just saying, this is the story. If you can make it that simple, that's really good. There's another one. Peace. War ends. Japanese accept Allied terms on emperor. So newspapers understand that element of being able to communicate directly the result in very, very short, straight to the point terms. And you could certainly use that in poster design. That's another good example. I'm going to skip over that. So don't use too many fonts. Try to keep it small as possible. Don't have too many words in one line. Do make sure your text is legible. Think about how easy it is to read. And do use visual hierarchies to convey those levels of importance so that people can just scan the titles if they want, or they can dig deeper if they're really interested. And do think of a good title. A little bit on images. Just to summarize, you can read through this. They, depending on whether you're using TIFFs, GIFs, or JPEGs, they compress them in different ways. So GIFs compress the images based on color. So solid colors in things like maps work well with GIFs, but work really badly with JPEGs. Whereas the opposite is true of photographs, particularly of natural photographs of humans and landscapes, is that GIFs are pretty bad and JPEGs are good. TIFFs are always good because they store all the information, but they're very large. And if you're trying to put them together in high resolution, especially for a big A0 poster, you'll find that you don't really want to handle 5 or 6 megabyte TIFFs. Do's and don'ts of data and graphics. Don't use a table on a graph would be better. Again, you might have some discussion about that, but that's again, it's about being effective or ineffective, and these are about general defaults. So do label your graphs appropriately and meaningfully, and think about what it is you want to say with the data. There's lots of good books and websites on this topic, and William McCannis is expert in the whole topic of data visualization. So do speak to him if you need advice. Color is great, but don't overuse it. And do think very carefully about the way you use color for readability. So use it so that it's helpful rather than just exciting and colorful. So construct the text and illustrated material systematic and logically. We've kind of looked at that. Here's some examples. Nice and systematic and logical. The one on the left is a good example. The one on the right is a bad example. The fact that it's got those horrible little arrows is a good example of the fact that the layout could have been better. Organize the text and illustrations in a compact arrangement with its own rhythm. So examples of rhythm. That one on the left looks pretty good. It's got a nice sense of pattern to it. So the size of those blocks and the size of the text are very similar. Whereas in the one on the right is it's got different sizes of text. The boxes are kind of different. It doesn't look like it hangs together very well. There's another example with arrows. Always a worry. Text boxes of different size and shape don't line up. So readily intelligible and structured with a high degree of tension. This one on the left I like. That's an MSc dissertation poster from a long time ago. Mostly black and white apart from a few well-chosen bits of red. The one on the right, very colourful and is trying to tap into the colour of the map, but it makes it very difficult and it's quite tiring. Reducing that down would have been significant. And all those boxes, they don't kind of look like they don't look terribly balanced as the challenge. And there's another one where it looks quite difficult. These boxes are kind of hastily put together. They're not really aligned. They don't really hang well. That one again, It's quite a good example where it does look like it fits together. And that one is sort of a little bit too sparse. This is a great poster. It's not a science poster, but it's a great example of something which is fantastically dynamic, but it looks like it has that element of, you know, a high degree of tension. It hangs together really well and looks like it's all together. I'm going to skim through this one very quickly. This is just to show you that you can take the same text and the same material, you can format it into a structure which takes into account the fact that the human eye wants to go to the middle there for about a third down, and then go up to the top to look at a little abstract, and then look down at some of the detail down from the top left to the bottom right. The same material with the same levels of hierarchy and restructuring as on the right hand side, and that doesn't look anywhere near as clear, as easy to look through. So I would look at that one on the left and take great inspiration from the way that that's been put together. Another little example of a cartoony poster, which is very good. Okay, just to finish, most of the material that you might want to put together, you want to think very carefully about the author. So who is it? You want to convey that. You want to convey some of the key results, the key messages. So what are they? And you also want to add all the extras, the why, the when, and the where. Make sure that you've got all of them. And remember your 3 golden rules. So make sure your audience wants to look at your poster, help your audience navigate the material, and reward your audience for the investment and time that they've given you to look at your material. And the final statement, keep it simple. Simple and straightforward will always win out. Okay, thanks very much for your time. I hope you find this useful.